Welcome to Morbid, Michigan. This restaurant might not look like much, but it harbors a dark secret. We're going to be talking about the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa today, and there are many theories about where he could have possibly gone. One theory involves this house here, which also looks harmless, but it just goes to show that there is more than meets the eye. I'd say probably everybody in America has heard Jimmy Hoffa's name at least once. And I thought it would be the perfect topic to cover on this channel since it's one of many times that the eyes of the nation have been drawn back here in Michigan. And despite the fact that he disappeared back in 1975, the investigations are still going on to this day. Before any further ado, let's get started. And before we get to the theories, we're going to start with what we know to be fact.
He had this tremendous energy. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't chase girls. All he wanted to do was work.
Jimmy Hoffa is described as something of a different breed. He was born in 1914 in Indiana to a father who was a coal miner. But his father died when he was just 7 years old, so his mother then had to support the family. She polished hubcaps, and she also would take in laundry from their neighbors.
I've had the impression from some of the things I've read that your mother ran a pretty taut ship. And
she sure did.
She was just as apt to give you a slap across the mouth if you got out of line as she was to say, go blow your nose.
She held things under control, and she brought us up the way she believed was right. And out of all of the problems that we had, I think that when you look back, that she kept us on the right road.
In 1924, him, his mom, and his siblings all moved to Detroit, and at 14, he dropped out of school to go to work.
My father came up the hard way. I mean, he was from the school of hard knocks.
It didn't take Jimmy long to realize just how terrible working conditions were for everybody at the time. Because this was during the Great Depression, workers were just desperate to get food on the table, and businesses knew that, and they would oftentimes take advantage of them. So he was working for Kroger as a freight handler, and he would unload crates off of the loading dock. It was during this time when he was 18 years old that he decided to take action, and he organized an impactful strike that would actually kickstart his career. So Kroger paid the workers really low wages, and they also would only pay them for the time that they actually spent working. So they were left waiting around for hours for loads to come into the dock, and only got paid for like a very small fraction of that. So Hoffa knew he had to work out a deal with management, and he decided to pick a very strategic time to do so. When a large shipment of frozen strawberries arrived on the dock, him and his friends refused to move. So his managers knew at that time they had to work out a deal, and they could not goof around. They had to do it right away. And they did. So within a year, Hoffa found himself organizing for the Teamsters.
His career thrived in large part in a very unregulated economy and political atmosphere in Detroit in the 1930s. He saw, in fact, that workers could succeed more often than not in that sort of jungle environment.
It's important to keep in mind exactly what was happening during this time with the American labor movement. Unless you're actually in a union, you probably can't think of a modern-day union leader. But at this time, they were a much bigger celebrity, which is why Hoffa's disappearance became quite as famous as it was, not to mention his involvement with the mafia. While even today people are still fighting for better pay, benefits, and working conditions, I think it's safe to say Hoffa and everyone involved in the labor movement during this time are instrumental in getting us our basic rights. Detroit was an epicenter of industry, but many workers and union organizers understood their power and weren't afraid to exercise it to get what they wanted. Ford made the smart step of doubling pay and cutting shifts from 9 hours down to 8. Many rivals hated that, but followed suit when they saw a huge increase in productivity and profit in just a few years. And then, the Fair Labor Standards Act passed in 1937, establishing a 40-hour work week, and making it so that people would get overtime pay if they worked more than that. At the time, most U.S. transportation was controlled by the Teamsters, and Hoffa was really good at getting people to join. In 1933, the Teamsters had 75,000 members, but by 1951, just a few years before Hoffa took on his role as president, they had grown to nearly 1 million. So the role of the Teamsters in United States politics was huge at the time. Because of that control that they had over transportation and deliveries, if they decided that they wanted to walk off and go on strike, that meant that most Americans could not get what they needed in their day-to-day lives. So the role of the union was much bigger at that time. So you might be wondering how a successful union organizer would find his name so closely tied into the mob. Well, it all began before Hoffa met his wife Josephine on a picket line. He was dating a girl named Sylvia Pagano. Now, Sylvia was actually Chuckie O'Brien's mom, who would go on to become the lead suspect in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. But Pagano was an ally of Hoffa's, and the two stayed close even after breaking up. She introduced him to her new boyfriend, Frankie Three Fingers Coppola. He was called Frankie Three Fingers Coppola because he had 3 fingers. His pinky and his ring finger got stuck in the door of a safe, according to legend, while he was doing a robbery. And the police started coming and he had to go fast, so they just cut off 2 of his fingers, and henceforth he would be known as Frankie Three Fingers Coppola. Coppola and Hoffa wound up becoming friends, and that is by some accounts where Hoffa's mob ties all began. It's important to keep in mind the labor movement was not all sunshine and rainbows, and it was a very violent time. Hoffa was not afraid to get his hands dirty. Even though he did become president, it's not really fair to consider him the type to sit up in his office with a suit and tie. He was, by all means, a man of the people. He's said to have gotten stitches 6 times just in his first year as a Teamsters organizer. By 1941, the union was undergoing a bitter turf battle with rival union, the Committee on Industrial Organization, in Detroit. The labor movement found itself struggling as the country was dealing with World War II. Some say Hoffa saw the mob as a means to an end. They had the muscle that the union needed.
The old adage about Hoffa was that he wound up going to the mob because he was trying to use them to go after stubborn employers who refused to be unionized. In fact, he used the mob to go after the CIO, which was raiding the Teamsters turf in Detroit.
But the thing is, the union actually wasn't where it started. Many companies would hire mobsters to try to intimidate members of the union. Most researchers say the mob didn't really care about the labor movement one way or the other. They just went where the money was at, and they knew that they could find it with Hoffa. So while some say that the mob owned Hoffa, others see it more as a partnership between businessmen.
There's no evidence that he was ever beholden to them. There's no evidence that they ever dominated his unions.
So maybe the mob didn't dominate Hoffa or his unions, but it's undeniable they were in there in a big way. The biggest being the Teamsters pension fund. Hoffa basically let the mob use the pension fund as a bank. So they would invest in things such as Las Vegas casinos, and they would get interest and bring it back to the union. This relationship became a huge thorn in the side of a very big name in politics, Robert Kennedy, who was John Fitzgerald Kennedy's brother. There's this really famous photo of Hoffa flipping him off less than discreetly at a Senate committee hearing.
In my opinion, he is never in his life ran up against a situation he couldn't dominate, that he couldn't control, and have his way. He's just a spoiled young millionaire.
That was the McClellan Committee. Robert Kennedy was in charge of investigating corruption within labor unions, and he really felt like Hoffa was the worst example of that.
Both men, the Ivy League aristocrat, Bobby Kennedy, and Jimmy Hoffa, really did have a lot in common. Both were feisty, both have been described as ruthless, both generated enormous loyalty and enormous hatreds, and I think there really was a chemical reaction between the two of them.
If I went into detail about all of the antics and tomfoolery that went on between these two men, this video would be like 10 hours long. But the point is that Robert Kennedy really wanted to pin Hoffa for all the corruption that he felt was going on within the unions.
I don't intend to have the impression left that's been stated publicly that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people, then.
Well, I don't propose to
You haven't moved
tough.
against any of them.
I don't propose to act tough, and I will follow the Constitution of the International Union.
After many failed indictments, he did succeed and send Hoffa to prison. It was there he would meet a very important person in this case, Anthony Provenzano. But I'll get back to why he is important later. Hoffa was sentenced to 13 years, but after serving only 5, then President Richard Nixon let him out, on one condition. He was not allowed to hold any title of union leadership for the next 9 years. Hoffa did not like that, and he wanted to run in the next election. So he tried to sue to get that condition dropped, and it did not work. Who was in charge of the union the entire time that Hoffa went away? Well, it was none other than his friend Frank Fitzsimmons. And the only reason that Frank Fitzsimmons was so high up in union leadership was because of Hoffa. They were friends. And while Hoffa was in prison, he kind of led things through Fitzsimmons. So Fitzsimmons did finish up the work that Hoffa was trying to get done and passed like the rules that he wanted to get passed. But at that point, he started to kind of distance himself. So Fitzsimmons was kind of just a more pliable leader. He did more of what people wanted. And Hoffa knew after a while that Fitzsimmons was not up to any good. And he even planned on publishing a book accusing Fitzsimmons of selling out to the mobsters. But before he could ever publish that book, Hoffa disappeared. Now we're finally getting to Hoffa's final moments. Witnesses say they saw him waiting outside of the Machus Red Fox in Bloomfield Township. As you can see, they turned it into an Andiamo's now, but Hoffa was pretty famous at the time, so people say they saw him. He was looking irritated. He was waiting for his friend turned enemy, Anthony Tony Provenzano, to meet him outside of this restaurant. They served time together and actually went in as friends because Tony Pro was a Teamster after all. However, they went out as the absolute opposite. Tony Pro went so far as to even threaten Hoffa's kids and family if he were to ever try to run as Teamsters president again. So it's no surprise that Tony Provenzano is a major suspect in Hoffa's disappearance. Tony Pro was part of New York City's Genovese crime family and a well-known member of the mafia. Despite their differences, Hoffa seemed to have really wanted to make amends, most importantly to get that support back on his side from the mob. So he told his family he was meeting two acquaintances at 2 that afternoon, Tony Pro and Anthony Giacalone, but no one showed up. According to the two gangsters, there was never supposed to be any meeting at all. Both of the two men had alibis as to where they were at the time. Giacalone says he was at the Southfield Athletic Club, while Tony Pro said he was all the way out in New Jersey. After waiting about an hour and a half at the restaurant, Jimmy Hoffa called home to his wife Josephine and said he would be home a little later that afternoon. In total, only about 5 people say they saw him at the restaurant, so there are some people that question if he came here at all.
Asked if we had seen him parked somewhere over here, to the left of Marcus's there, and we racked our brains and tried to think if we had, but we hadn't, unfortunately.
Even more interestingly, these witnesses that did see Hoffa say that they saw him get picked up in a burgundy Mercury Marquis. So when Hoffa disappeared, his wife was concerned when he didn't show up at the time he said he was going to show up, because a big part of his character was he really hated when people were late and he hated getting stood up. So she knew that something must have been wrong. Investigators did find Hoffa's car in the parking lot after his disappearance. So as far as we know, this restaurant was the very last place Hoffa was ever seen. So now that brings us to the theories. One theory that I want to just get out of the way immediately is the theory that Hoffa is still alive and that he just ran off. Anybody that knew Hoffa knew that outside of his work, his family was number one. And if he told his wife he was going to be home at 6, he was going to be home at 6.
He wasn't a womanizer like most men are.
He wasn't?
No, definitely not. He wasn't a drunk. And he wasn't a gambler. Here's the things that men do when they have money and time. He didn't do any of these, and I'm telling because I know.
Given the tensions leading up to his disappearance, foul play seems much more likely. Now, going back to that Mercury Marquis, you might be wondering who was driving it. Some of the witnesses say it looked to be Chuckie O'Brien, who, going back to what I said before about Sylvia Pagano, that was her son. And Chuckie was kind of like a surrogate son to Hoffa. He treated him like one of his own kids. And most of his family say that if he saw Chuckie in the car, he would have felt safe and trusted enough to go inside. And he was driving a burgundy Mercury Marquis that day. Chuckie said it was transporting 40 pounds of raw salmon to a Teamster official's house. And he said that blood from the raw fish spilled all over the back seat that day, and he had to go get it cleaned right away. To no surprise, many people found that incredibly suspicious. Investigators found one of Hoffa's hairs in the car, and dogs found his scent in there. That car in question belonged to Anthony Giacalone's son. O'Brien was pretty close to the Giacalones and even called Tony Jack Uncle Tony. So while Giacalone says there was no meeting, it's pretty weird that his son's car was spotted there with Hoffa's hair and scent inside. According to Frank the Irishman Sheeran, it was Chuckie who was driving that day, and he was in the passenger seat. Sheeran labels himself a professional hitman, and his account of what happened has made its way to Hollywood in the Martin Scorsese directed movie The Irishman, where Al Pacino plays Jimmy Hoffa.
Well, it was strange for many years for all of us, and then I'm sure there are stories about what happened to other, but nobody's really come out and talked about it. This film does, and I guess I'm going with the glow. I think this is the way it happened, but someone told me it didn't happen this way. I wouldn't be surprised.
Sheeran says that he was ordered to kill Hoffa because the mob was concerned that basically he was going to snitch on them about all the business that they'd been doing within the Teamsters pension fund. And they knew that Hoffa was really desperate to get back into power. Working as the Teamsters president was one of the most important things to him in his life. So being out of that and being banned from it was pretty devastating. And I guess their fear was that he would do anything to get back into power, even if it came down to ratting them out. This is one of the most widely accepted theories, but also faces a lot of scrutiny. Sammy the Bull Gravano and Michael Franzese are both public figures who are open about being former members of the mob, and both of them say it didn't happen that way, and Sheeran never pulled the trigger. Sheeran wrote a book about his life in the mob, and frankly, it flopped. And when he wrote another book that came out when he started saying he was the one who did the hit on Hoffa, it became a bestseller. So some people think he just made it all up to sell his book. Most do agree that it was someone in the mafia who took out Hoffa. And the main line of thinking before Sheeran came out with his story was that it was Salvatore Briguglio in the car instead, and he pulled the trigger at orders of Russell Buffalino. Then the story goes that they took him to a waste incinerator in Detroit or in Hamtramck and had him disposed of there. Still others believe that Hoffa is buried in plain sight, maybe even encased in cement in the structure of the Renaissance Center. Now that story comes from Hoffa's former driver, Marvin Elkind, who says that he was with a group of Teamster officials walking by the Rensen, and Tony Giacalone boldly said, "Say hello to Jimmy Hoffa, boys." So that's where that story comes from. A more recent inquisition into Hoffa's whereabouts takes us here to Roseville. Now, back in 2012, investigators dug up that driveway, searching for Jimmy Hoffa's whereabouts after somebody reported having seen a body buried there all the way back in 1975. And despite tests by Michigan State anthropologists, there was no evidence found of any remains. And there are plenty of other theories. Some people say that Hoffa was killed at Rolland McMaster's horse farm in Milford. Tony the Greek said in a Playboy interview that Hoffa was actually killed in Mount Clemens, and I tried to find any research backing up that claim. I couldn't find anything, no specific addresses or information that the FBI ever really looked into that claim, but what Tony the Greek says is after they killed him at that house, they took him to the Giants Stadium and buried him underneath there. That is not a theory that I personally believe, because I just don't think it makes any sense to take someone out in one place and then dispose of them halfway across the country. It's likely that if he was taken out in Detroit, his remains are somewhere around Detroit. Just because the transporting would be so dangerous, I don't think that these experienced mobsters would have put themselves in that kind of jeopardy. So why so many different theories? Michael Franzese, former mobster, brings up the idea that the people who were responsible for getting rid of Hoffa went on a disinformation campaign after. So basically sending law enforcement and everybody involved on a wild goose chase afterwards. Now, Michael Franzese has his own theories about what happened to Hoffa, which he's kind of alluded to in different podcasts and stuff. He discredits Sheeran's claims because he says that he just did it to sell his book, which that makes sense. However, Michael Franzese's whole career is based off of his former life in the mob and kind of profits off of it himself in a similar way, so it's kind of hard to take that seriously. Regardless of what you think happened to Hoffa, it's clear he did make many enemies over the course of his years. Some people even think that Bobby Kennedy had him taken out, and those two were enemies, so he kind of did have the motivation there. But even to this day, they're still doing digs. The FBI is still investigating, and there's new tips coming in all the time. But sadly, most of the people that were suspected to be involved or who were involved have long since passed away. So it's not clear if we will ever get a definitive answer. It's pretty sad that Hoffa's surviving family members have to live out their days never really knowing exactly what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. But I may have missed a few theories. There's so many different ideas as to what could have possibly happened that I couldn't cover them all. I couldn't do it. So if you have any, You could just leave them in the comments, let me know. Maybe I'll make another video. Who knows? But until the next time, have a great day.